Nobody is telling us that we have to do double programming. What they're telling us is that we have to create something with quality. And of course, double programming kind of is our insurance policy around that, so that two people, they can't possibly both get it wrong, but of course they can. Traceability is hugely important, I think, and to try and get us out of this kind of mindset around double programming. And it's not that I'm against standards. I'm totally for standards, in fact. But they've got to work, and they've got to be achievable in I think, going forward in a more automated fashion. Having standards that are kind of sympathetic to AI, automation-driven processes, I think would be, a major step forward for us. That's where I think AI will get truly beneficial, that it will take away some of the manual heavy lifting that we do with regards to clinical data. But of course, you've got to have a human in the loop somewhere. So for that reason, I don't think programmers will ever disappear.
Do you think that we will ever be able to completely eliminate double programming, and how long would that take?
Yes, I think we can. I think there are signs that companies can't afford to do double programming already. I think it's a question of having the right approach and the right tool set to allow them to do it.
Welcome to another episode of the Verisian Community Podcast. Today I'm joined by Andy York. Andy is a clinical data scientist, vice president at Novo Nordisk. He has been programmer for 4 decades, and he's seen the rise of statistical programming as we know it today. In today's episode, we talk about the history of programming, how the modern statistical programmer came to be. We talk about CDISC, we talk about the standards, we talk about AI, we talk about the future, open source. Try to cover all of the topics that most of you will be interested in. It's a great episode. It's a long one, but I hope you really enjoy it. And if you have questions or you want to reach out to Andy, feel free to do so, as well as to us. Enjoy the episode. Andy, it's so nice to have you finally on the podcast. So firstly, welcome.
Yeah.
And let's just get straight into it. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how did you start in the world of statistical programming?
Yeah, it's quite a long tale. I mean, I started off doing what's called a thick sandwich degree, which was essentially mathematics for business. And there was a bit of mathematics, statistics, computer programming, economics, a few other bits and pieces in there as well in terms of mathematical modelling and so on. And as part of that sandwich course, I had to spend a year in industry. My year in industry was spent with a company called SmithKline & French. Of course, everybody now knows as GlaxoSmithKline, so you can tell how far back I'm actually going.
Just for reference, we're talking here about the...
Yeah. So you're going to hear a lot of history probably today. And that naturally led, once I completed that after a year, to me go back into the industry. And I joined a UK company based out of Welwyn Garden City called Roche, based in their old offices, not where they are today, but in a small phase 1 unit in the Roche campus near the railway station there. And then I was there for something like 8.5 years, something like that. But so, one thing very much led to the other. So, and my full career, in truth. So.
Tell us a little bit about that time. And I think what's really I've been dying for people to hear your story, because certain things about why things are done today. And I think one of the things that I always try to explain to people is that, especially this industry, the importance of it didn't just appear out of nowhere. And the reasons may sometimes surprise some folks, and it may lead to wonder why things should be the way they are. And this is true in life in general. But so maybe with that frame of mind, can you tell us, our listeners, what is the day, how would a day of a statistical program look like back then? Back then,
so just explain, when I joined Roche, we started as biometricians. So if you were a clinical data manager, you're a biometrician. If you're a programmer, you're also a biometrician. If you're a statistician, so whatever your speciality was, you kind of were within that single job title. And when I first started, even back at SmithKline & French, most of the work was being done by statisticians, most of the programming work. And of course, statisticians are quite expensive, and so the thing was to take some of the workload away from biostatistics and have it done by statistical programmers instead, who were specialists at programming and were able to do it more efficiently than the statisticians. And sorry, statisticians. And we'll get back to that. And we would employ those skills to take away some of the more manual lifting, if you like, behind the data analysis and exploration. And to put things into a little bit of context, I mean, when I was at SmithKline & French, they had their very first PC turn up with PC SAS on it. We weren't just using SAS then, we were using things like GenStat, GLM, BMDP, all sorts of different packages that were more academic packages. We had SAS on a mainframe, which is what I mainly used, but even then it was a clunky IBM mainframe that was just really slow by today's standards. So it built from there. Yeah. What we did then is essentially still what we do today. We're producing tables, figures and listings from the data that gets collected out of our clinical database, clinical trial system, and then using SAS to manipulate that data to get to the desired kind of outputs. And a statistician would play a really big part back then in actually doing the QC of those outputs. So we didn't have anything like double programming, but we had quality processes that kind of went through actually reviewing and understanding the outputs and, do your ends tie up, for example, across all of your tables. And that's something that seems to get missed a lot these days. Does it make sense?
Why is that? Why do you, if you zoom into that one particular point, things that were better than now?
I think it's because everything is so specification based today. You have your output specifications and you have your derivation specification of how to get there, and people are so used to following those that actually I think there's a risk you turn off your brain. Right. And do that kind of sanity check to say, well, actually, does this make sense? Yeah. Does it look right? Does it feel right? And that's how I was brought up as a programmer, was to make sure that I was checking everything myself, making sure that, as I say, my ends were consistent across the different populations and tables. And I think today we're kind of just, we kind of miss that at times. So,
and if we go back to, and just for reference, we're talking about the 80s, the 90s, right?
Yeah.
This is pre-CDISC, pre-Fuse, pre-AI.
Pre-CDISC, SAS was version 5 back then.
Right.
So 5.16 I started on, I went to 5.18. We had no Proc SQL. I think even Proc Tabulate was fairly new at that point.
Yeah. These days, there is so much activity at the Fuse level. At PharmaSoc, there's all these conferences, there's working groups, and at CDISC. How did people get together back then? How do you knowledge share across different groups?
So I think in my area, PSI was the biggest outlet at that time. So Fuse didn't exist, as you say. So the PSI conference was where everybody went. And, I think there wasn't really a lot of difference back then between if you were a statistician versus if you were a programmer, because inevitably a programmer still had a kind of mathematics, statistics kind of background anyway. So PSI was still very relevant to you as a programmer. The other aspect was SAS were running major conferences still then, which were called SOIG or SUGI, depending on if you were Europe or US. And they were kind of like the Fuse conferences are today, with masses of papers, masses of interest in terms of how to do your programming and so on. And importantly, pharmaceutical dedicated streams, because again you have to recognize that SAS was built on serving the pharma industry, not so much the clients that it has now. We're just a small part of what SAS's customer base is at the moment. So it's that kind of died a death a little bit, and so Fuse was born out of SAS stopping to hold the major conferences like SOIG and SUGI.
So if we look at specifically things like validation, and if we, I know you've got views on this, but double programming, let's say. So if we fast forward maybe a little bit to, I guess, end of the 90s, where things are sort of trying to standardize. Tell us a little bit about your experience and your thought process behind that, and why that actually came to be.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. So I moved to a large CRO called Covance at the time. And when I joined Covance, like all CROs, they were heavily process-based. So you had your SOP and you had your process that all of the programs had to follow. And it's interesting because the process was, kind of a very manual process, but it was kind of understandable from a quality perspective, because your first programmer would write your code, produce your output, great, job done. But a second independent programmer would do a quality check of the log, for example, of the output from each individual step that the original programmer had created when they wrote their original program. So you'd have a little prop print at the end of every step. And you'd be tracing, the data through each of those steps, following it on your prop print outputs. And then somebody else would do a review of the output to make sure that, for example, the ends were all kind of correct and so on, as I've said before. And that's kind of interesting because it's like a manual traceability, isn't it? So you've got a full kind of, somebody checking it for accuracy, somebody checking it for reliability or reproducibility, and then someone doing this kind of like traceability step to make sure that the code was okay, of a very high quality, and could be, submitted back to a client with the results. So that's how the CROs worked at that time. And then there was a lady in Covance called Louise Webber. She'd been at Covance before and came back. And I think she'd been working for a pharma company. She said, we kind of introduced this process where we have two independent programmers, and they independently verify each other's work, and then they figure out where the differences are and come to an agreement on what's correct. And from a CRO perspective, if you think about the amount of resource that goes into this traceability approach, it's quite significant, and it takes a long time. So from database lock to releasing your tables, there's an awful lot of effort goes into that in order to be able to give your tables back to the client and say that we think that they're of the highest quality. Well, this was a way of reducing that time and reducing the amount of effort that you took to get a reasonable assurance of quality. It's a risk-based approach, if you like, because both could get it wrong. So it was rapidly adopted in Covance, and we saw immediate...
Was Covance the first one to properly roll out this?
It was the first one I saw it in, so I don't know if it was the first one. But we saw an immediate uptick in terms of performance and the way in which we actually produced our output. And of course, from a CRO perspective, time is money. It's all about profits and making money, obviously providing a service in return for that. But if you can find a way of doing it that much cheaper and that much faster than your competitor, then you've got a real advantage. And of course, once one starts doing it, they all have to do it. Word gets around, and then it becomes kind of like endemic within pharma, CRO side at least. And I'm not sure how we got to the actual pharma companies, but of course, they learn as well from what the CROs are doing. So my assumption is that they kind of, maybe even started in pharma, but they also started to adopt the practice as they went forward. So,
if you consider the programming community as a sort of one cohesive thing that sort of spreads knowledge around, how did you see CDISC rise in that? Because obviously you've got the double program, which obviously that's just something that emerged, that became a best practice.
Yeah.
I guess two things there. So it took, I'm guessing, a couple of years for that really to take hold, including at the sponsors. What about the whole CDISC and the standards rise? Because that took a lot longer really to establish themselves, and eventually the FDA to adopt SCTM and ADAM. Yeah. But would you say those were interconnected? How did that relate to globalization at the same time?
Yeah. What's really quite interesting is that, we created analysis data sets, back in the 1980s, 1990s when I was doing it the old way. But they weren't required, they weren't done to any specific standards, so it's up to the program essentially. And if you wanted to, you could even go from raw to, your output.
And I'm guessing every sponsor will have its own mandates, or the teams do as they wished?
In the CRO, usually the sponsor said, please get on with it, we trust you, do whatever you think is right normally. But it increasingly became that sponsors had their own standards because they wanted to pull and integrate the data for submissions, which in themselves is a massive effort, particularly if you've got all different formats across all your trials that you're trying to bring together. So there was this kind of like internal pressure, if you like, within the pharma companies to kind of introduce standards to make this aggregation easier over time. And so, there then came this idea that, introducing standards through CDISC, through an organisation that was kind of independent of the companies, might actually bring a degree of efficiency, across the industry, whereby everybody is kind of working towards the same standard. And hence, SCTM was born. And of course, we all do SCTM in pretty much the same way. So it was actually quite successful in that respect. And it was quite understandable as well, because whenever I produced analysis data sets, they would be very SCTM-like, unlike ADAM, which we'll get onto, I'm sure, in a moment. But, each variable was a column, and of course, going across the rows, you had generally your patient visit kind of identifiers and patient visit data. So it was a very natural kind of format to understand data, because it was like a table that you would have perhaps in an Oracle database, let's say, or some other database. So they came together with SCTM. That was successful. They then started looking at ADAM.
This is early 2000s.
Yeah, this is early 2000s. Yeah. And, my then boss actually was part of the Adam work group.
Right. At Covance, you were still...
At Covance still, who was putting together the ideas around the Adam standard. And it's quite interesting because he waved a piece of paper at me one day, which was a paper that I wrote several years ago prior to that, which was around the use of XML to put together a standard for lab data transfer, or in fact any kind of data transfer. And he waved this at me and kind of smirked and smiled at me, and it was like, well, okay, we know that Adam has, or CDISC has XML in it, so it's kind of like, well, did you get the idea from me, kind of thing. That was the intimation that that had happened, which is quite funny. But if you think about the Adam standard, it's completely rotated, so it's one great big long column of data, essentially, with 3 or 4 columns of data in reality, and all of your analysis parameters are in the rows, essentially describing that. So you end up with these massive data sets that are very long. And if you think about SAS actually processes data far better in an SDTM type format than it ever would do in an Adam format, because of the I/O is easier. There's something in SAS called the program data vector, where it reads in a row of the data at the time and kind of processes that row before it moves on to the next row. But you can't easily do that. You're actually multiplying the rows manyfold by having an Adam standard. So I was never fully bought into it, if I'm honest. And I did discuss this with him on occasion. And Adam kind of is a guideline, because it's not truly a standard, because it's up to each company how they implement Adam. Okay, so some parts of Adam are standards, so ADRG, for example, but yeah, it always kind of seemed an odd choice to me. But the industry again adopted that and went forward. So the idea being that you're 1 proc away from your output. Did it succeed in that? I don't know. I'm not convinced that it ever truly did, but that was the intention. So
what do you think? What do you think that is? I mean, that's what everyone. The Adam being 1 proc away from your tables, listings, figures.
Well, if you think about it rationally, okay, you're front loading all of the derivation that you need to do prior to getting to the table. So the table part becomes kind of really easy to kind of succeed at and to do. And it's true, that's how Adam basically works. But I think there's always a degree of complexity in the data that kind of makes it really hard for you to be 1 proc away at times. And, it's kind of defeats the purpose if you put all this work in and then you still have to do a few extra steps to get to your kind of output, to my way of thinking. So, I wouldn't say it was a failure. I would say it was a consequence of the design, and the fact that clinical data is just difficult. So
how do you also reconcile there's sort of 2 things pulling at each other at the same time? On the one hand side, most of stuff you should be able to standardize age, but on the other hand, you're doing science.
Yes.
So to the extent that you that you don't want to standardize the science bit because you want to leave the room for exploratory analysis.
Yeah.
I guess, where do you think the industry would be today if there were no standards?
If there were no standards, I think we would be producing maybe thousands of outputs per trial, and we would be spending an awful lot more time doing exploratory work, probably at the expense of the actual submissions. And of course, it's the submissions that benefit the patients at the end of the day. And I'm all for science, don't get me wrong. There are some amazing drugs out there. I worked on some amazing drugs that have a whole breadth of application across different therapeutic areas. But you don't have an infinite budget, and so you have to kind of pick and choose as a pharma company where you spend your resources. So I think we would be, probably 10 times worse off in terms of where we needed to get to deliver to our clients if we didn't have standards. So I think there is a part to play there. We'll probably talk about AI later, but it's arguable whether, in the new reality of AI, whether that's such a relevant thing or not. But certainly from today's world and prior, that's definitely a consideration. So,
but would you consider, where would you want to iterate most on in terms of so Adam is obviously, I think, because CDISC has a strong push into 360i. What's your take on the current direction for both where they want to take the standards into, which is sort of this 360i one data model, and at the same time, how do you think a standards body like CDISC should support the industry? So
it would be really good if we can harmonize across companies, because
at the ECRF level? At what point?
I think, well, there are some efforts around the ECRF level, but, obviously that's not so much my area of speciality. If you look at Open Study Builder, for example, there's an attempt to build something around the ECRF level. But I think, we're all ultimately producing the same things. If you have a table of adverse events, serious adverse events, demographics, concomitant medications, key safety results, vital signs, and so on, we're all doing exactly the same thing in slightly different variations of that. It would make absolute sense for us to actually produce these in a standard way, because make it far easier for the reviewers when they actually come to review your results, because they know that, well, okay, we don't have to look too deeply into your adverse event table to see if you've done something odd. It's going to be the same from company to company. So there's a huge argument for it. And by pooling our resources, maybe we can get away from needing thousands upon thousands of programmers to having far fewer, and not putting so much stress on ourselves in the process of actually getting to the outputs for the betterment for patients, of course.
No, that's super interesting. Let's move on to talk about open source.
Yeah.
Firstly, what is open source for in your words, and specifically in relation to statistical programming? What is it, and why should it even matter?
So, this very much relates to the sharing of code. And going back to what I was just talking about, where we're all producing essentially the same thing. So why not share code and make life a little bit easier for us? The argument against it has always been around intellectual property. And, there may well be certain elements that are still sensitive towards intellectual property rights there, such as, efficacy analyses and things like that, custom analyses and so on. So that makes perfect sense that you kind of protect that. But in the areas, I've talked about, open source will tremendously help speed up the production of the mundane stuff that we do every single time, every single trial, that everybody probably is getting quite bored doing, to be perfectly honest. I know I did as a programmer. So, my route towards that, to overcome that, was actually to rewrite all my programs every time. So I never copy programs and reuse them. I rewrote them from scratch. So by rewriting all my programs from scratch actually gave me a little bit of incentive to enjoy the programming aspect of doing that, because I might do it slightly differently each time. So, but the output was all the same, and I wrote code really fast. So yeah, it didn't really matter. And of course, the other thing is, it is harder to understand other people's code. You ask any programmer what they prefer, they would always prefer their own code to somebody else's. So there's perhaps a slight trade-off there. But if you're talking about standards, then and taking a lot of the stress out of what you have to do, then it's a pretty fundamental part of what you need to do as a business. So
specifically to relation to open source, I sometimes make the joke that it feels a little bit like quantum computing, which it's always 5 to 10 years away. At least in quantum, it's I think 30 years. Now, lately, there seems to have been real momentum. Novo is obviously one of the global leaders when it comes to R, and there's other companies that have done submissions, some publicly announced, others more sort of private. Roche has been quite also really good at actually having a community-led effort on the adoption of different packages. What do you... I think, why has it taken such a long time to be adopted, which you sort of touched on just now, but in particularly, I'm always reminded of a talk at one of the Fuse events where someone did a great presentation on presenting, these are all the packages that you can use in R, which is sort of the whole point of being open source, that you have that optionality. But then one of the questions with a very serious concern, how the hell do I know which one to use?
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's a very understandable concern, because, the nature of open source is, how do you trust that package ultimately, and which is the right package, as you say. But the mindset is very different, I think, in open source. So because it's community driven, you can actually see how many people, for example, have downloaded your package and are actually using it. So, and it's as I understand, it's quite a vocal community. So if they spot an error or an issue, they're going to tell you about it. So it becomes a very different approach to kind of validation. And whilst there are companies out there that offer validation services for packages, I've worked at pharma companies that actually do that validation internally to build up that level of trust in the packages that they're using. And they might have a suite of packages that they say, yeah, you can use these. These other ones you can use, but at your own risk. You can have to validate it and make sure it's executing correctly and doing what you want. it's actually no different really from a SAS proc, because the skill of a programmer, as I always say, is not how anyone can write a piece of code to execute a SAS procedure or an R routine, R package. The skill is actually how you put these things together and how you understand how the data goes from A to B and then to your output, so that you're doing that manipulation correctly and that you trust that result, and then that your output you trust as well because you're applying the code correctly. And that's true of any programming language. And you can teach anybody a program and get certification and stuff like that. It doesn't mean they're a good programmer. And in fact, I don't rate certification at all for that reason. It's only through applying the programming language that you know whether you can trust that the person is doing the right thing. So it's back to your point, and it's that collective approach to making sure that people agree that package is safe and that is the right package to use. And of course, you have things like Pharmaverse, Admiral, and stuff like that are putting a huge amount of effort into putting together packages that we know are safe. And at Novo, we submit our own packages to that because of some of the feedback that we got from our submissions saying, well, the FDA said, well, we'd kind of rather they were in the public domain than actually within Novo. And we responded to that by building and submitting these kind of open source packages, and we'll continue to do so. So that kind of collaborative approach is so important to make this work. If you don't go down that path, then the risks to quality increase, and there is an increased chance that something will go wrong in what you submit to an authority, and you'll have to backtrack at some point in the future, which would be very embarrassing, very damaging for share prices and things like that. So it's a big thing. It's not to say it didn't happen when people did it in SAS, but the R community are such advocates for what they're doing. I think the quality is built into what they're doing, whereas maybe on the SAS side it's just a little bit lethargic now in terms of how programmers approach their work. And the risk of doing something wrong because they're just following their spec sheet, for example, it's subsequently higher.
It's something really interesting you said earlier, which relates to, I think, the distinction you were making between the programmers today and statisticians today versus before, which is the lack of domain expertise for let's say the individual trial, and then I guess maybe the science and behind the statistics. Yeah, that programmers today might lack, given the specialization that we're seeing. And I think you mentioned this also in private ones when we spoke, which is some people have as a job title SCTM programmer, which sort of in a way, or SAS programmer, which is sort of, which I really like. And it's the same true in software engineering, where you're a software engineer first, so you know how to think. Yeah, you know how to think about the analysis. You know how to think how to build good software or good structured analysis, and you understand the domain as well. And what I'm hearing from you, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on how that has evolved over the last couple of decades, which is this really separation between the more domain experts, which sometimes can be a programmer that has programmed for the last 3 decades in SAS, but knows oncology really, really well, versus a lot of spec sheet programmers that have come in, especially the last 10, 20 years, that just focus on this spec and just do SAS based on...
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is cost-driven, of course, that, you see many thousands of programmers now employed in the industry, and Fuse conferences are just huge now with 700 plus attendees. And if you think that's a representative, maybe 1% of the total that's out there, there's probably 70,000 statistical programmers in the world or something, very broad, estimate, of course. But to get those kind of numbers, you're going to struggle to have 70,000 domain experts. And so, and keep costs under control. So the industry has kind of got forced into a corner where it's having to say, well, how can I achieve volume with, cheaper resources? And there's no disrespect to anybody, it's just the way it is, who may not be total domain experts. They're just, as I say, they have the specifications that they're following. They trust that those are correct, and they trust that they're interpreting them correctly. And of course, double programming kind of is our insurance policy around that, so that 2 people, they can't possibly both get it wrong, but of course they can. So we kind of build up this kind of monster, if you like, of a lot of kind of resources that are kind of, they're kind of okay at what they do, but they're not necessarily the best experts in what they do. And so, I would always encourage people to really look at your data, understand your data, try and get as good domain knowledge as you possibly can, so that actually you can tell if something's right or wrong by looking at what you're producing, as opposed to, does it match the spec? So, but that's the training that people, I think, have to go through. And is that the way forward? I've talked to you in the past about job creation for statistical programmers, and I think as an industry we've failed that we've created so many things layered on top of each other that we've created a huge amount of work for ourselves. I mean, in my day when I was programming, we had maybe an analysis data set and an output. Now we have an SDTM, we have an ADAM. We're soon to have analysis result data sets on top of that. And then we actually get to the table, and then you got your submission on top of that. So it's just putting even more pressure and strain on us as an industry. And it's not that I'm against standards. I'm totally for standards, in fact. But they've got to work, and they've got to be achievable in I think, going forward in a more automated fashion than perhaps they are today. So, having standards that are kind of sympathetic to AI, automation-driven processes, I think would be, a major step forward for us, looking into the future. So,
do you think the cost argument for SaaS is a valid one if you consider the total cost of a clinical program? I mean, SaaS obviously costs something relative to our being free. Do you think that's a good argument, or?
Well, ours not entirely free, of course, because you've got usually the cloud-based hardware and software and so on. The fact that it's in the cloud doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It still sits there and has to be paid for in somebody's warehouse somewhere. So it is a fallacy to say R is free. A layer on POSIT Workbench and stuff like that. So over the years, I think, because I mentioned at the beginning that there were a lot more software packages when I started than there were, because SaaS kind of killed off a lot of their use, and we're seeing a kind of beginning of a new cycle, perhaps, where there now are alternatives to SaaS. So, Python, Julia, perhaps, in the future. We'll see. And maybe something else will come along completely out of the blue. But SaaS now has a lot of competition, whereas in the past it didn't. So I think, SaaS is expensive, and I think it's kind of relied on the industry absorbing that expense. But now the industry's kind of pushing back a bit and saying, well, we're no longer willing to perhaps meet those costs in the way that you demand, and I think they need to kind of respond to that. It's not huge in the sense of a clinical trial, when you think about the amount of money it takes to do clinical trials these days. So maybe it's something that we're, arguing over because it's an easy target, perhaps. That's always possible. But I do think there is an argument for SaaS to be a bit more responsive to the changes in the industry. And you have to wonder where it's going to go if they don't. Is this their kind of like Kodak moment? If they're not careful, everyone's going to cloud, R-based solutions, bespoke kind of solutions, moreover than dedicated kind of, solutions that tie you into an ecosystem, perhaps, which is exactly what SaaS does. So there's considerable pushback against that at the moment, certainly amongst the big pharma. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
It's an interesting dynamic, particularly when you look at some of the conferences. If SaaS sometimes is a major sponsor, and then you look at all the talks on those conferences, and third are about moving to R. And I agree in the sense that, in general, for us also as a smaller software vendor, the temptation to react to that is strong. And so I've always found with some of my SaaS friends at SaaS that how do you communicate your strengths based in an environment where everyone's talking about moving to R. I found a lot of people at SaaS to struggle to do that when, even if everyone were to move to R today, every clinical trial in the world has still been done in SaaS.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I do think the R community is very effective at putting their case forward, absolutely. Almost to the style of being evangelistic about the use of R and why we should all adopt that tomorrow. But the reality is that there are decades and decades of legacy data out there and legacy code, and we're not going to sit there as an industry and convert all of that code to our programs. So SaaS still has a fairly big part to play in the industry, and it's probably going to be around, even if we said, right, from today we're not going to use any more SaaS, you're still going to need it probably for the next 10 years or so, just because of those kind of legacy projects that you've had and the odd requests that you might get through from agencies saying, please, can you tell me how many adverse events of a certain type you had or whatever. Those requests do happen. They happen all the time because, when you get more and more patients using a drug, you get more and more events of interest, for example, and you get those kind of questions. So you have to be able to go back and reproduce what you've done in the past. And there's no guarantee, if you suddenly switch that to R, that you're going to get the same results. Hopefully you would, but, there's no guarantee. SAS is here for a long time, I think. I think it's more a question of, our program is going to be here for a long time. Instead of
just cause a couple of heart attacks.
Yeah, I know, but it's a question that everybody's kind of asking themselves. Certainly my peer group at the moment, there's a lot of wrangling over what does AI mean from the point of view of statistical programming in the future. So, and evidence, that it can do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So.
We're going to come back to that at the end.
Yep.
So this is a good cliffhanger for those of you listening to stay towards the end of the episode to listen to the future of clinical programming. Before we get there, so with that in mind, open source, wanting to be not locked into an environment like as SAS wants you to put in. Let's talk a little bit about the modern statistical computing environment. Now, you're obviously at a major pharmaceutical company. How should one think about your computer environment if you're at a Novo level versus, let's say, a smaller biotech?
Yeah, I mean, we've taken the approach at Novo that we use the right language for the right task. Now, we're rapidly proving internally that you could probably actually do R for the majority of what you need to do, to be perfectly honest. But we're not saying to our programmers, you must use SAS or you must use R or you must use Python. In fact, we're actually saying at the moment, probably just avoid Python for the moment because it's just complicating things a little bit too far. So that's the Novo approach. It has a lot of resources and a lot of people that can look at setting up a statistical computing environment that actually meets the needs of a multi-language kind of environment where you can do pretty much whatever you want as long as you validate it and it makes sense and so on. If you're in a smaller biotech, chances are you're outsourcing, for one. And, the difference between SAS and probably doesn't mean a great deal to biotech because generally they might have a few statisticians. There might even be contract statisticians or, certainly not that many within the organisation. You might have the odd programmer here and there. But you're very reliant perhaps on, the CROs actually delivering to you, the outputs, the files, the data and so on. So if I was biotech, I think I would be in the position of, CRO, you tell me what you want to do. And you go off and do it and you prove to me that you validated it and so on. So I think, our uptake is probably going to be driven largely through the CRO determination of that rather than your smaller biotechs, dictating that you must use R, for example. Which makes a lot of sense. But I think you'll also see the CROs increasingly adopt as we go forward. They're going through the same cycle of change that the pharma companies are doing because they're kind of forced to. Pharma companies are saying to them, well, please use R for this particular study because we want to incorporate it into our submission further down the road and so on. So that kind of trend will happen. One thing, to bear in mind is that if you look at the population of programmers, probably your average SAS programmer is in their late 30s by now. Your average R programmer is probably somewhere still in their 20s. So there is that kind of drive towards, from a recruitment perspective and an education perspective, that is also driving this kind of this progression towards open source. So, and I mustn't forget Python in that too. There's lots of Python advocates at Novo that would love to do everything in Python as well. So you've got two languages there that are being put forward.
Do you see a Python submission happening anytime in the near term?
Not in the near term, simply because I think it's the regulators are saying, please don't at the moment, more than any other reason. There's no physical reason why you can't. And in fact, at Novo, we actually have one team that's actually proved that they can do fully validated work in Python for, I can't remember exactly what it was they were doing. It was some sort of safety update for a particular study. And they did it all in Python. So clearly it can be done.
And the regulator was fine with that safety update in Python, or you did it with Python and SAS?
It was done, I think, pretty much entirely in Python, so my assumption is that they were okay with it. But I think it depends, and I'm not sure exactly what it went to, because not all regulators will want the code. So it's probably a European regulator, so they're more interested in the output than the actual code, I suspect. I don't know the exact details. But
let's talk about traceability. So traceability is obviously a golden keyword.
Yeah.
Part of the raison d'etre for the standards. What are, I guess to start with, and this is an interesting start because it feels like a circle going all the way back to pre-double programming days.
Yeah.
What do you consider to be traceability? Why is it important, and what are the challenges in achieving traceability today?
Yeah, so traceability is understanding exactly where your data comes from. So you can make sure that from the moment it gets entered into your clinical trial system, that you have full traceability right the way through to the table, actually in reverse, typically. So there's no doubt or question mark over how that data actually came to be in that table, how the derivation that might have occurred to transform that data was actually done, and what the inputs into that derivation would also be kind of fully traceable. As I kind of mentioned at the start, back in my Covance days when they were doing this manually, you had that kind of traceback, and because it was heavily manually intensive, we ended up with double programming. Now I think if you can have traceability that is far more automated, involves a lot less kind of resources, suddenly you're getting back to the point where you can do that probably more efficiently than you could do with double programming. Because if you can use, say, large language models, AI, to kind of understand the full traceability of that data and how you got to that point of the table, and you can demonstrate that during an inspection, well, you've ticked a major box there in terms of giving the regulators confidence that your data is good and your analysis is good. And it's actually starting to strip away one of those layers of building extra work for ourselves, because double programming requires two people. Now suddenly you need one person and probably a program that's going to run against that output to say whether it, to kind of log the traceability of it, which somebody independent can then review. So you might be going from two people down to like 1 1/10 person or something like that. And you kind of instantly starting to save a lot of time, effort and money to get there. And of course, if it can look over the different standards, jump from analysis result data or output to analysis result data set to ADAM to SETM to RAW, then that saves a huge amount of work, investigation when things go wrong. But from a reproducibility perspective as well, it's really important because, as I say, authorities can come back to you years after you've finished the work and say, tell me what happened here, or provide me a variation on that table, and you can kind of use that traceability to see quite quickly how that program was put together and how it works, and then you can make your adjustment, and then you can produce that output quite quickly for the regulator. So traceability is hugely important, I think, and to try and get us out of this kind of mindset around double programming, because I don't know of any other industry that does that, other than ourselves. So
there isn't.
No.
Just to double down on that point a little bit, why is it so hard to get traceability? You're still looking at code. And this is obviously something that we do in our bread and butter, but would love for you to share with the audience. Why is it so hard to get traceability?
I think it's hard because partially of the human factor. In the original case where we're doing it manually, you've got to put a lot of trust in that person to trace through correctly. They can still get it wrong. But mostly it's due to, I think, some of the complexity of our data. There's little doubt that the footprint of data on a clinical trial is growing. It's growing all the time, and even at Novo, we're not talking genomics anymore. We're talking omics. So for the broad category of all different types of omics data, we're starting to look at imaging files where perhaps AI might be used to kind of look at images and start to pick out characteristics in those images automatically for you, for example. So the volume of data is kind of increasing. The complexity of data, as the industry gets more competitive, in the sense that there's a lot of drugs out there that are doing the same thing and competing against the same pot of patients or pool of patients to help. the margins start to get smaller in terms of what you're looking at. So people looking for differentiators, that kind of like traceability might allow you to kind of spot some of those perhaps a little bit sooner, particularly in the omics space. And yeah, it's not like you just have one huge data set. You have maybe 30, 40 different domains in a typical clinical trial on the Adams side and SCTM side. And a lot of those domains can change depending on the endpoints that you're looking at. So, and statistics gets more complicated as we go on, so missing not at random analyses that we kind of like do today that we never used to do in the past, for example. So the techniques are moving on as well. So makes it very hard to avoid it, I think.
Why is it that the standards, or is there potential for the standards to do more to provide traceability? Why is it that it's still so hard to get full traceability despite having the standards in there?
Yeah, and I think CDISC, and I forget the version number, did introduce some traceability variables into its standards.
Yeah.
But, it's kind of questionable as to whether that kind of gives sufficient traceability, I guess. And, traceability isn't just about, how you trace that data through. I think it's about the quality of what you're doing and really having that trust in what you're doing. And I think you get better trust through having more robust traceability than just a few variables in as part of a standard. That to me is a bit more of a checkbox kind of exercise as opposed to building genuine trust. And I think also I've seen some of my peers, and I won't name them, and it's probably even true in Novo to some degree, that we're starting to abandon a little bit the notion of double programming. So where you copy a program across from one study to the next, there's an assumption that program's somehow right. And a lot of companies are now employing that on a risk-based approach to say, yeah, okay, we're going to trust that code, copy it, but we're not going to do full double programming on it, perhaps, because we believe that it's right. And it just doesn't work that way in terms of, there becomes quite a quality risk, I think, at that point, that you're assuming that code's right. And we all know that endpoints kind of change a little bit over time that you're trying to do. Maybe the CRF, the way the data is collected, changes. The design of the study changes. The actual calculation of the endpoint changes. And so, that traceability becomes even more important in that kind of context where, you because you don't have enough resource, you're starting to say, well, okay, maybe we'll skip double programming in this particular instance. And I find that quite a disturbing trend. It's not one that I like to see at all. But it's definitely out there at the moment.
And generally, in terms of the different types of regulators, what does it take to provide, I guess, a traceability, but particularly the reproducibility, accuracy across different regulators, especially the FDA, EMA, the Chinese, the Japanese, all look at different things.
Yeah, I mean, it is tough because when you do submissions in different regulatory bodies, particularly going across from US to Asia Pacific, they are very much looking at what interests them as opposed to being consistent across. There's some kind of synergy, I guess, between them, but it's not totally sufficient to say you've got to do things. You can do things the same way for each. So that brings a lot of challenge in terms of dotting the I's, crossing the T's, making sure that you do everything right in, say, a China submission or a Japanese submission or whatever, compared to what you did maybe for EMEA. And that, again, creates a lot of work within an organisation. And, Novo, perhaps like others companies, has the ambition to submit in multiple regions at the same time. It just seems to be the way that, the industry is kind of driving this. So you've got to have full control in order to do that. Full traceability of what you're kind of like doing to be confident of what it is you're producing. So, and again, it adds to the number of people that you need and the job creation side of things as well. So, so the differences are real. They definitely exist. And I think having these kind of AI ML agents that might actually automatically go through and check for these kind of differences and discrepancies in the future would be a good thing. Having, and have them actually tell you what the traceability as well of those differences. So it helps kind of explain it. We definitely want to move into a world where the AI is kind of helping the programmer understand what's going on, but doing, a lot of the kind of like the heavy lifting on their behalf. Because we're all human, we're not infallible. We're bound to miss things as we go. So.
There was a point there that I wanted to mention in relation to the standards, which is, this is one of the reasons why we started the company, our company Verisian, which is that if you look at the standards, you're representing a derivative from the source of truth of the analysis, which is the actual code that is run.
Yeah.
And the standards themselves are a derivative, and you just have to trust that it's derived at the right point in time. But when you look at the descriptions of certain analyses, or you can call that the how certain things are, like the actual derivation descriptions, the computational methods, ensuring that those are correct in the code is something that we found very interesting, because it that is the true traceability for the analysis. And that's sort of how we ended up with some of the technology that we're building to provide the true traceability at the code level, which is different to the traceability of metadata level, which is where the standards operate in.
Yes. Yeah. Again, it comes back to what I was saying right at the very beginning, and this does feel like we're going full circle. Exactly. So that as a programmer, I wanted to know that the data that was in that table was as good as it could be. Yeah. And to be honest, back then I didn't really care about metadata, that much. Right. It was all about the data and all about getting it to the right place. Metadata is important in today's world, with the complexity of the footprint of clinical trials increasing and the complexity of the data. But it's not the be all and end all. The actual result is the most important thing. It doesn't matter. The metadata doesn't tell you whether the drug works or not. It just tells you how to get to a conclusion on that, and hopefully the correct conclusion. So, but there's still got to be humans in the process to kind of understand and interpret that result to say, is that correct or not? So I actually agree with the approach that the data is king, not the metadata.
So let's talk about something that people are very worried about, which is obviously their own jobs. And so let's touch on the future of programming, which I know you're doing a lot of work on, a lot of thinking at Novo, and obviously with Novo being one of the leaders in the space, there's tremendous potential how you're shaping the industry and the way people are thinking. So I guess maybe to start high level before we get into the specifics of whether people will still have a job or not. What do you since ChatGPT came up at the late 2022, what are some things that have surprised you and some things that you've been disappointed with regarding the promises made?
So it's really interesting that ChatGPT hit the scene, and it was really quite. Everybody was like, can you see what I can do in ChatGPT? And they use it to produce an image. Let's say they've described in English language text, and it does all of this, and it's an okay image, but it's only an okay image because maybe there's an artifact in that image that's just wrong. It happens all the time. That I saw one not too long ago. It was like Nelson on the Trafalgar at the Battle of Trafalgar on his ship at the Battle of Trafalgar, and he had both arms. And I know that Nelson only had one arm at the Battle of Trafalgar. That's the kind of thing that kind of trips you up with these ChatGPT things, because they're only as good as what they're fed, and you have to spend a lot of time feeding them and building the large language models that kind of go behind the scenes.
Can I give you another example for that? That is a really good one. If you ask ChatGPT or any other LLM, give me a clock that gives a time that is 3:30 or anything other than, I think it's 10 p.m. because every single clock on the internet has this smiley face where the clock has, I think it's 10 past 10 p.m. It will rarely show you a different time other than 10:20, and you can ask it as much as you want, and it's because what you're saying is that understanding as we humans do, which is this conceptual understanding of something that goes behind the actual words, is just not there.
Yes, yeah, and we in this industry we cannot afford to be less than accurate in what we do. I accept that, and there's a general acceptance that 95% quality might be okay, But when you drop your quality levels to 95%, do you go to 90 after that? Do you go to 85? At what point do you say, well, that's not okay? And if you start out with a tool that does not have quality from day one, it's not starting at 100% quality ChatGPT, it's starting more like at 50% or lower, in my view. Yeah, it's not a good place really to start. And if you start asking ChatGPT to write code for you, you've got to really question or check that the quality of that code is acceptable. Most of the examples I've seen, around code writers in AI code writers, for example, we had one company come and demonstrate to us. It was a video, it wasn't actually a live demo, so red flag immediately there. But it was like, let's have like 4 or 5 lines of simple code and a description of that. And I know a good programmer would write that code in a minute or something like that, but the writing in the description took like 3 or 4 minutes to get that line of code out. A lot of our programs, or these programs I used to write, could be well over 1,000 lines long. How are you going to describe that textually, in English language to get that code to come out? So, so the ChatGPT approach is too simplistic for what we do, and ultimately, unless it develops that kind of inherent ability to understand code better, then it's not going to get there quickly enough. The way in which you constrain that is around standards, perhaps, which goes against, and we were talking a little bit about this, the nature of AI. The nature of AI, you just throw loads of data at it and it kind of gets it right. So, you throw 25 pictures of a sofa at it and then give it a random sofa to identify, and it tells you it's a whale. It's that kind of thing. So you need to feed it 200,000 pictures of a sofa so that it gets the right idea. So there are a lot of risks with it at the moment. It's still very young, and in my view, for that reason, it's going to take a lot of time to kind of like mature and get to the point where it's kind of is a really helpful tool. I think we might see a breakthrough in the next 3 years or something, 2-3 years, I think. And certainly some companies are moving quicker than others towards that. Most of the companies in my peer group are kind of just exploring it at the moment. So yes, I still think we're some way off, which is going back to the is our job safe kind of question. So,
which is how it is.
Yeah.
For now.
What I think we will benefit from, if you look at end-to-end automation, so from data through to the table or even CSR, is agentic AI agents actually running that process for us. Perhaps even writing code where there's good standards in place that we don't have to, but obviously checked by humans and understood by humans. Then ultimately writing that code and saying this, Andy, you know what? There's something here that doesn't make sense to me. Please check it. Then I go in as a pair of eyes and a brain and actually say, yeah, okay, I think that's doing it correctly or not. Or there's a signal in the data or something like that we need to investigate. That's where I think AI will get truly beneficial, that it will take away some of the manual heavy lifting that we do with regards to clinical data and giving us warning signs that, yeah, you need to go and check that. And it's interesting, of course, that the FDA are now adopting AI to do their review of submissions going forward. So they announced this, I think, a few weeks ago, because you can imagine that for them, an AI agent would trawl the way through the submission and say, yeah, this looks worthwhile investigating or asking a question about. Makes sense to me. But of course, you've got to have a human in the loop somewhere. So for that reason, I don't think programmers will ever disappear. They might write a lot less code in the future, but I think even there we're probably quite safe for a couple of years, as I say. In the future, a statistical program may well become, and as we call them in Novo, clinical data scientists, where actually the emphasis is on understanding the data, not so much understanding how we got there with the code, because that's written for you, but really understanding the traceability of that data and how we got there to that endpoint.
And so with all that in mind, what are some of the things that, how is Novo basically approaching the AI space practically? So
we're doing a lot of experimentation, of course. We have a large AI group within the company. I used to quote something like 50, 60 people. It's probably more than that. I haven't really looked recently, but there's a dedicated office in London with just AI stuff based there, as well as in other locations as well throughout Novo. And they're looking broadly across the entire company because, obviously clinical development is just one part of Novo Nordisk, but they are specifically now looking to run some trials where there's kind of like some AI enablement for our area to see what it can do. I don't necessarily think it's been done with necessarily expectation of a glorious outcome kind of thing where it kind of solves all our problems overnight. But I think it'll test the boundaries of what is possible and where we need to perhaps consider, okay, there should be a human in the loop at that part or whatever. So that's really quite exciting. And I think I said earlier, contrary to the kind of general use of AI, so AI I think is generally developed to work across broadly without any kind of like limits or boundaries kind of imposed on it. Well, in order to speed that up, we're kind of trying to set the boundaries a little bit in terms of internal standards that kind of facilitate the AI to go from atom to output correctly without having to go through a lot of hallucinations or whatever they're called to kind of give us all the slightly bizarre outputs that going back to the picture of Nelson, we might see otherwise.
But I think this is an important point because, one way of looking at a hallucination is as a bug. The other, which I would argue is the right way, is that it's a feature. Hallucinations, you're constantly hallucinating. It's just that, let's say, you're hoping that 70% of it is actually right and the 30% is not. And so I think the way we also think about it is how do you ensure that you stay within the guardrails where you are, in a way, you're delegating the validation still to a human. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of great stories. There's some great AI companies currently, and it's not to say that it's all bad. It's just that the expectations have been set so high, which you can only really go down from that. Yeah, that you're still dealing with an incredible statistical model, but in a regulated environment where you are making decisions on life and death. How do you make that in a way that actually you understand what is being proposed? And the fear here is that if you have a fully agentic system going to your Atom code base and just proposing, 6,000 lines of code for something that could have been done in 15 lines of code, that's very scary because who's going to go into the 6,000 lines of code and everything that can happen from there? Yeah,
I think that's very fair, and I think it's just part of the learning curve that we are on at the moment to kind of
as an industry
to see what the boundaries of that are. And I'm sure over time that 6,000 lines of code will become the 1,500 lines of code or whatever is a bit more reasonable. Do we accept from a compute perspective that we're running 4 times as much code as we actually need to? And of course, the potential error is greater. The more code you have, of course, the potential for error increases. So I think it's something that we are going to have to explore. And see the kind of like the outcome of these experiments. There is one of my peer group that is quite well advanced in this already, and they kind of say scarily so a little bit, but I still don't think we're down the full-on like Arnie Terminator route with this kind of thing, as opposed to more like an iRobot where you have this helpful kind of assistant. Even though iRobot kind of went a bit wrong in the film. It doesn't in the books, but it does in the film.
Your spoiler alert.
But if you don't try, it's never going to change. And we've basically been doing the same thing for 40 years. The 40 years I've worked in this industry, the premise is still exactly the same. I'm producing an output from data, and it's still the same. There is the question over, in the future of the industry, do we go more towards kind of like more on-demand kind of app-based reporting, away from static outputs to things that allow you to kind of explore the data? And I think, I would love to see the day where, instead of submitting this great big massive paper to the FDA, be it electronically or in physical paper, that you end up with an app with an AI engine behind it, and the FDA can say, interrogate the data in the way in which they want to understand the outcome, just as we have done as a company, that we've interrogated and we produced a report of our conclusions, and we say, here you go, have a go yourselves and see if you agree with our conclusions. That to me is, looking into the future is, I think a very desirable outcome to me.
It's a good point. It is pretty mad that there is a static deliverable for such an important critical milestone, which technical limitation on it being at least dynamic.
Yeah.
Whether you're using AI or not, I'd say that's even a separate question.
Yeah, I agree. But the two things seem to be coming, together, and it's certainly something that we wanted to do at Novo Nordisk, and it was something that we, have been looking at as to whether we can give people on-demand tables. They wouldn't necessarily be validated tables, so if they wanted something that they produce through an app to go into CSR, well, it has to come back to biometrics or biostatistics to kind of validate. And I think that's quite reasonable, before anything goes out publicly. And it would have to be on that kind of understanding that people don't just create something and put it in a paper, because a little bit of knowledge can be very dangerous when it comes to producing or analysing data.
Where do you see traceability in AI come into play? And I'm referring specifically here to LLMs being, you're still sort of, because and there's a great paper on this that we spoke about earlier, where it's a Virginia tech group that looked at the one-shot outputs from LLM, so not agentic, which obviously which would be a better approach, one-shot inferences for statistical analysis, fairly simple analysis, but the output accuracy was 51%.
Right.
So now you can argue if you make it agentic, that's going to go up. That would certainly be true. It increases the complexity in terms of the architecture, and but the counter to that counter is to say that this particular paper, the analysis were fairly simple. It's just a few dozen lines of code for the analysis. So the approach that we're taking now is to say that, okay, if we actually take full study traceability, which is being able to compute and actually understand code. And by understanding here means that we can deterministically say, okay, these are the lines of code relevant for this output rather than a probabilistical model. Yeah. Then here we're marrying the worlds of the more deterministic symbolic AI field, which is reproducible, with the probabilistic approach, which is the field of the neural nets and Jeff Hinton and Jan LeCun and sort of the LLMs of today. So that's where we strongly believe the future is in. My previous startup was in symbolic AI, which is this whole field of how do we encode the world deterministically. That is almost impossible to do. But when you do that, you can start to reason over facts because you encode concepts. And that's sort of the big counter to a lot of the LLMs. And the other point is that SAS code is fairly restricted. There's not a lot of open source SAS code.
No, I think it makes a large degree of sense to me, because if you ultimately you're boiling it down to a number, aren't you? That number says, this is how much I trust this piece of code, whether it's 51% or whether it's 99% or whatever, somewhere in between. And if you can get that number to a reasonably high, most of us are kind of, cognizant of a risk-based approach, and we're kind of willing to accept some risk in what we do. And it may not be perfect, because a lot of time those perfections might be a footnote that's slightly incorrectly spelt or something like a title or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean the data's actually incorrect in that table. That's usually the presentation. And, if you can get to the point where you can get that measure of trust of that output that has been produced through the AI model, then you know where to direct your efforts to actually for QC. So obviously we go to the 51% version and say, is that really right to me? Whereas if something was at the 95% level, we say, okay, I think there's an element of risk that I can trust that. And is that any better than double programming, for example? So double programming probably has, I don't think anybody actually knows what the failure rate is for double programming, but you can imagine that there are, it is probably around that kind of like between 95 and 99% level of accuracy or something like that, perhaps. Maybe worse, I don't know. Nobody's ever tried, to my knowledge. So. The other kind of approach I've seen is multiple LLMs used. So you're using one LLM to check the results of the first LLM, and actually you could probably daisy chain and have maybe 3 or 4 LLMs off the back of each other, each checking each other. And what you then have is you have an AI version of double, maybe even triple or quadruple programming.
Exactly.
Where these things are like kind of checking. Now I don't know. That's not a proven approach at all, but it's something that is still interesting. I know one company that's kind of attempted to do this for SDTM programming. So it'd be interesting to see where they get to. So that's it's another approach, but an interesting one as well. So a couple of final questions. In your own words, where do you see the role of statistical programming / clinical data scientists evolve over the next 5 to 10 years? Yeah, I think, as I say, it'll be less hands-on programming. There'll be an interim period where programming skills are still relevant for a number of years, I think, but eventually that will shift more towards people who truly understand the data and the story of the data and the outcome of the clinical trial. We're already, seeing in Novo that statisticians are kind of like sitting higher in the food chain these days, and so statistical programmers or data scientists will even be asked to do statistical analysis, maybe even start to contribute to CSRs, for example. So it's a real kind of like lifting of the role up to a higher level, where it has perhaps a lot more meaning and a lot more influence on what happens. Over a longer period, 10 years, it may get even more sophisticated than that. But I think it'd be a very brave person to look at a crystal ball from 10 years from now, but say exactly where we'll be, because this is a slow-moving industry. I'd love to see it speed up, and I'd love to see it change. Don't get me wrong. After 40 years of doing the same old stuff, that kind of disruption is exactly why we're looking at companies to help us get there. And I think there's a lot of bright people out there now who are kind of helping us solve this problem, I hope. So.
Would you say it's sort of a little bit going back to the beginning, where there wasn't such a division between statisticians and stat programmers? Yeah,
I think this lifts the theoretical statisticians who are more focused on methods to really develop on statistical methodology in clinical trials, and perhaps even the use of more external data sources as trial arms and things like that to help support the analyses in a real world context, because clinical trials are always in a very constrained population context, and that's definitely an area that's of interest to them. So I think it's going to lift everybody up ultimately. We may not need tens of thousands of people to do it. That's the downside, but you've got quite a horizon there to actually diversify skill sets. And what I would be saying to somebody who is a relatively young SAS programmer is first learn R, then learn Python. Diversify your programming knowledge skill set. I would also tell them learn more skills, project management type skills, how to present skills, how to interpret data skills, more of the statistician type skills as well. So just become more of a rounded person as opposed to somebody who just sits there and writes programs.
Well, folks, you heard it there. Time to learn Python and some other skills. So as we start to close today, and we saw a lot of different things from AI, open source, the history of programming, I have a couple of rapid fire questions, and I'd love just to get your quick thoughts on this.
Sure.
So do you think that we will ever be able to completely eliminate double programming, and how long would that take?
Yes, I think we can. I think there are signs that companies can't afford to do double programming already, and that in certain cases, they're taking steps to reduce the amount they're doing. I think it's a question of having the right approach and the right tool set to allow them to do it, and the conviction in what they're doing. Nobody is telling us that we have to do double programming. What they're telling us is that we have to create something with quality. So let's find a better way of doing it and save some resource.
What's a book that has had the biggest impact on you?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I do read a lot of science fiction, and of course, as you know, science fiction is very forward-looking. And I like the writings of Asimov. And I mentioned I, Robot earlier, and that was one of his books, and he writes a lot about robots, and a lot of these intelligent robots do a lot of thinking and eventually kind of like start nudging humanity in certain directions through large-scale statistical models. It's really quite fascinating to see how it kind of like works, because humanity starts to stagnate and go in on itself and not be creative and inventive. So it kind of recognises that the human society at the time will collapse, and then it tries to work out a way to kind of lift it back up again within a certain period of time. It's really quite fascinating as a read.
Wow. That's a good way to actually end the program, I would say. But I have just a couple more questions. What's one thing most people understand about the role of the statistical programmer?
I think they understand that we're here to actually help them understand the data. We're not data managers that are there to make sure the data is of extremely high quality. We're not there as a statistician to give them the full statistical analysis interpretation of the data. But we are there to make sure that, we complete that journey from raw to output in as accurate way as we possibly can with the highest quality that we possibly can. And that's important because, a lot of people actually probably don't understand the role of the statistical programmer. We're kind of a, backroom, kind of group in many respects, if you look at the full clinical team. And we are trying to change that at Novo, and I hope other companies do as well.
Who is a leader that you admire and why?
That's a tough question because a lot of leaders have a lot of negative characteristics as well. If you look at Elon Musk, he's awesome in some of the things he's doing around space exploration and building rockets and stuff like that, electric cars and so on and so forth. But it comes with a lot of baggage. I think I probably would have to go back to somebody like a Bill Gates of this world or Barack Obama, who kind of like want to achieve good at the same time as wanting to innovate and move things forward. So that kind of person, but I don't have a particular favourite.
Well, Obama is speaking at the O2 here in London in September.
Oh, cool.
I think I got an email on that last week. Tickets were rather expensive.
Okay.
I might skip that one.
Okay, all right. Not surprised.
And finally, and you sort of already did this, but if you are speaking to a young statistical programmer just starting out in the industry, what's one piece of advice that you would give them? So one thing they should learn.
Yeah, diversify your skills. Don't put yourself in a box, and be agile. So that's the one skill I would say, is be agile in your approach to your career, what you learn, and where you want to focus. So.
Amazing. Andy, this has been a great conversation. I think there's so many more things that we can speak about. Actually, is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with before we wrap up?
Oh, well, it's trusting the process. We're all in the same situation with regard to AI. There's probably some doubt there. I think most people recognise that we will adapt as human beings to this, and maybe our jobs will change in the future. But I wouldn't let it worry you. I would just take that agile kind of approach and think about, what are my strengths? Really build on those strengths as an individual. So
awesome.
It's been a pleasure.
Andy, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Maybe we should do this in 1 or 2 years' time and we can revisit some of the predictions that we made.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. All right. Take care. All right.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this very sunny London day.
Will do.